Hello, here we are again. Before beginning my lecture on Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest, I want to share with you some announcements for the remainder of the semester. First of all, after today, I will be sending you 2 more lectures this coming Friday and then 1 week from today, next Tuesday. Both of those lectures will be on Synge's Playboy of the Western World. That will be the last play we will be covering, and next Tuesday will be, as scheduled, my last lecture. This means that we'll be dropping the last comedy that I had on the syllabus, Ionesco's The Chairs. We're dropping it for 2 reasons. First of all, there's not enough time, though it would only be 1 class. We're really out of classes. And second, I had planned to give it to you in Xeroxed form, and obviously that's not possible. Okay? Now, this means that the final exam, and I'll be giving you the specific dates on that in the coming days, the final exam will cover 14 plays, 8 tragedies, and 6 comedies. But although it's comprehensive, this final exam will lay considerably greater emphasis on material that we have treated since the midterm exam, which then would include 2 tragedies, Blood Wedding and Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, and then the 6 comedies. Okay? Now, given the challenges that we are all facing this semester, I've decided to shorten the final exam to certainly make it less fully comprehensive and less work for you than I would were it in a regular course. So it's going to consist, this exam, of 1 3-page informal essay, which will be on comedies. You'll have your choice of a number of topics. And it will also include a number of short answers, which I have not entirely yet decided upon, but which I'll describe to you, well in advance of the exam. Now, obviously, these exams will be emailed back to me, and you will be able to use your notes, the books entirely. It's a take-home exam. Okay? Now, since the final exam is going to be shorter, it is also going to count less toward your final grade. Originally, as noted on the syllabus, each of the 2 papers, the midterm and the final, were to count for 25% each. However, I've decided that since we're going to be shortening the final exam, it will count for only 15 to 20%. That is a little bit variable, because it will count for 20% for those of you who do well on it and 15% for those of you who don't do well. All right? Correspondingly, as the final exam shrinks in size and importance, your upcoming comparative analysis of 5 to 6 pages increases in significance. Its value now will range from 30 to 35% of the final grade. So I ask you to bear that in mind as you think about that essay, in particular as you think about the topic on which you want to write and the particular organizational format that you want to use. You'll remember that I've asked you to notify me about the topic that you want to write on by Monday, April 27th, because the paper itself, remember, is due as an email attachment on Friday, May 1st. Okay, I think that covers it. I will be saying more about the final exam in my broadcasts to come, but please, if you have any questions or concerns, let me know. Okay, now, in discussing the various sources of comedy in The Importance of Being Earnest last time, I noted that although Wilde's Comedy of Manners sometimes satirizes wealthy British society in Victorian England, particularly its courtship rituals and attitudes toward marriage, that although we do find this satire, it is of a relatively gentle form of mockery, and that it is also a satire that comes in sort of momentary gusts or pinpricks rather than in any sustained way. And we see this kind of fleeting, whimsical satire, I think, in the scene of Jack's marriage proposal to Gwendolyn. When they meet at Algy's apartment, Gwendolyn invokes the language of high romance, the idea of love as destiny, in order to explain why she was so drawn to Jack even before ever meeting him. She says, "For me, you have always had an irresistible fascination, even before I met you." Jack looks in amazement, and she explains, "My ideal has always been to love someone of the name of Ernest. There is something in that name that inspires such absolute confidence. The moment Algernon first mentioned to me that he had a friend called Ernest, I knew I was destined to love you." Jack says, "You really love me then, Gwendolyn?" "Ah, passionately. Darling, you don't know how happy you've made me. Oh, my Ernest!" Now, note that this is Wilde's send-up of the exaggerated and largely insincere language of romantic love that traces back, at least in its rhetoric, to the Middle Ages, but was popularized in mass-market fiction, the idea of love as a kind of destiny. Ironically, Gwendolyn's feelings that she is destined to love and marry a man with the name of Ernest, of course, has nothing to do with actual earnestness in the man who she is determined to marry. In fact, Gwendolyn is an ironic woman herself, and despite these exalted ideas of love, she doesn't want a man who is earnest in the sense of sincere and staid and straightforward. She wants the name Ernest, but not anything conveyed by the adjective earnest. Now, Jack realizes that if he is to marry Gwendolyn, he must keep up the pretense of being this figure she calls Ernest, and keep up the pretext of the persona, the London persona that goes with that name, someone who is rather dashing and cosmopolitan in their life in London, because it is that set of characteristics that she associates with the name Ernest. On the other hand, the idea that someone might be named John or Jack, no, those names are for Gwendolyn not satisfactory, because she associates them with a kind of plodding, faithful domesticity. Thus, Gwendolyn says that the name Ernest suits you perfectly. It's a divine name. It has a music of its own. It produces vibrations. Jack says, "Well, really, Gwendolyn, I must say that I think there are lots of other nicer names. I think Jack, for instance, is a charming name." "Jack? No, there is very little music in the name Jack, if any at all. Indeed, it does not thrill. It produces no vibrations. And I pity any woman who is married to a woman named John. She would probably never be allowed to know the entrancing pleasure of a single moment's solitude. That's really, the only really safe name is Ernest." Well, Ernest is safe, as Gwendolyn uses it, in that paradoxically, a man named Ernest, as she imagines it, would not be tediously earnest. He would, in some ways, be much more likely to give Gwendolyn some time on her own away from him, which is what she seems to require in a husband. Now, note that this is hardly a need, this need to be away from your husband sometimes, that corresponds to Gwendolyn's idea of exalted, fated love, but nonetheless, there it is. What follows in Wilde's parody is sort of the crowning irony about Victorian courtship rituals. The proposal must take place, according to formula within this culture, on bended knee. But of course, it proves to be a complete farce, because here Wilde inverts the entire custom of having Jack propose in this respect, because both he and Gwendolyn are aware that what they are doing is merely going through prescribed, sort of socially required motions, that they are enacting an obligatory rite in which there is absolutely no spontaneity at all, again, notwithstanding Jocelyn's insistence that this is high romance. Gwendolen takes a more ironic view of the courtship ritual and the proposal itself than Jack does. She is infatuated with the idea of storybook love, but when it comes to the social prescriptions, she sees them as contrived as they are. Jack says, "Well, may I propose to you now?" Gwendolen, "I think it would be an admirable opportunity, and to spare you any possible disappointment, Mr. Worthing, I think it only fair to tell you quite frankly beforehand that I am fully determined to accept you." Gwendolen! "Yes, Mr. Worthing, what have you got to say to me?" "You know what I have got to say to you." Yes. You don't, but you don't say it." Gwendolen, "Will you marry me?" He goes down on his knees. "Of course I will, darling. How long you've been about it. Let's get it over with." Okay, now, Gwendolen sort of short-circuits this time-honored proposal ritual by announcing to Jack that she will accept it before he ever makes the offer. So in a certain sense, it is she who proposes. And she even tells him that, say it, come on, get it over with. But Jack is a man of convention, much more of a man of convention, in fact, than Gwendolen really wants. And he is perhaps a bit too earnest in this respect. He feels that he has got to say it, and so he does. Now, of course, the proposal itself is soon nullified by Lady Bracknell during her interrogation of Jack that immediately follows this engagement. It comes about when Lady Bracknell, in the course of this interrogation, discovers Jack's dubious origins. Now, I'd ask you to watch the clip of this scene from the classic 1952 film version of Wilde's play. In the scene, Wilde pokes fun at the upper-class preoccupation with family origins that establish one's place within the class system according to one's bloodlines. Well, Jack fails the test that Lady Bracknell is administering when he is forced to confess that he knows very little about his own bloodline or his familial past, as he describes his origins this way. He explains to her that I lost both my parents. Lady Bracknell, to lose one parent, Mr. Worthing, may be regarded as a misfortune. To lose both looks like carelessness. Who was your father? He was evidently a man of some wealth. Was he born into what the radical papers call the purple of commerce, or did he rise from the ranks of the aristocracy? Jack replies, I'm afraid I really don't know. The fact is, Lady Bracknell, I said I had lost my parents. I should be nearer the truth to say that my parents seem to have lost me. I don't actually know who I am. By birth, I was found. Found? The late Mr. Thomas Cardew, an old gentleman of very charitable and kindly disposition, found me and gave me the name of Worthing because he happened to have a first-class ticket for Worthing in his pocket at the time. Worthing is a place in Sussex. It is a seaside resort. Where did the charitable gentleman who had a first-class ticket for the seaside find you? In a handbag. A handbag? Yes, Lady Bracknell, I was in a handbag, a somewhat large black leather handbag with braces on it, and an ordinary handbag, in fact, Jack has kept the handbag. Lady Bracknell observes, in what locality did this Mr. James or Mr. Thomas Cardew come across that ordinary handbag? Jack replies, in a cloakroom at Victoria Station. It was given to him in mistake for his own. Well, nothing can be more plebeian than to be found in that most public and democratic of places, Victoria train station. But the fact that the man, Cardew, who found Jack, had a first-class ticket to a seaside resort called Worthing, points to the fact that Cardew was actually a wealthy man, wealthy enough to raise Jack amid prosperity and to give him significant financial advantages. But he was not Jack's father. Now, amid this social satire, what really interests Wilde in the scene is the question of identity itself, which is a theme that is central to all of Wilde's work. When Jack confesses, quote, I actually don't know who I am, He unknowingly expresses Wilde's view that none of us know our identity because there is nothing underlying, fixed, or determinate to know. There is, in short, no central, stable self that we discover. For Wilde, we exist in a state of fluid potential, and we are free, therefore, to create ourselves however we wish and in as many different guises or artificial identities as we wish. Now, Jack's unfixed identity illustrates this, his unfixed identity by birth, in an extreme way. He doesn't know who his father or his mother are, and even the last name Worthing that he goes by is entirely artificial and almost arbitrary. He's given that name simply because the person who found him was going to that town. Unlike Wilde, Jack would like to have a fixed identity, but he finds almost against his will that instead of a fixed identity, he has actually manufactured two artificial personalities with two corresponding names. He is Earnest in the city, where Gwendolen fell in love with him under that name even before meeting him, and where he is something of a man about town and bon vivant, and he is Jack in the country, where he is the quiet, devoted father figure to his ward Cecily. Now, by contrast, Algernon knows his family background, but that means very little to him at all when it comes to conceiving of himself as a self, as some sort of personal identity. Instead, like Wilde, Algy celebrates his ability to invent and reinvent himself in various postures and constructed identities, just as he has invented his imaginary friend Bunbury. Now, as we'll see, Algy appropriates the name Earnest that Jack has fictitiously assigned to his supposed younger brother, part because he just delights in the multiplication of selves. It was a convenient ruse, this idea of a younger brother named Earnest, for Jack, in that it allowed him, whenever he wanted to leave his ward Cicely in the somewhat boring countryside and to go off to London, where he is known as Earnest, and he lives a life of more considerable vivacity and social interest and intrigue. Does Lady Bracknell believe in the conventional idea of identity, though, as conferred by birth and class, as she talks to Jack and discovers that he has no known parentage? Does she believe that there is such a thing as an identity that is conferred to us through a bloodline or through birth? Well, to put it another way, is Lady Bracknell earnest and sincere about the class codes that would assign one's identity on the basis of one's family lineage? Well, on this question, Wilde is very tricky. Outwardly, Lady Bracknell is a grande dame of the aristocratic order who seems to uphold the most rigid conventions of her class: propriety, family connections, the increase in wealth through marriage. But her way of stating these prejudices is so extreme that it renders the prejudices themselves absurd, and we begin to realize that Lady Bracknell is mocking the very conventions that she is enforcing. She enforces them, but she also laughs at them, and in speaking of them, reduces them, as she phrases it, almost to the ridiculous. After Jack has explained his situation, and she has observed that it is indecent to lose both parents, one is bad enough, she then observes, in barring the marriage, "I would strongly advise you, Mr. Worthing, to try to acquire some relations as soon as possible, and to make a definite effort to produce at least one parent of either sex before the season, the marriage season, is over." "Well, I don't see how I could possibly manage to do that," he says. "I can produce the handbag at the moment. It is in my dressing room at home. I really think that ought to satisfy you, Lady Bracknell." "Oh, me, sir? What has it to do with me? You can hardly imagine that I and Lord Bracknell would dream of allowing our only daughter, a girl brought up with the utmost care, to marry into a cloakroom and form an alliance with a parcel. Oh, good evening. Good morning, Mr. Worthing. Lady Bracknell sweeps out in majestic indignation. Well, it's an indignation that is almost self-parodic. She won't let her daughter, Gwendolyn, marry a parcel found in a handbag, she says, reducing Jack to the status of object, but in a way so extreme that she seems almost to be laughing at her own excessive prejudices. Happily for Jack, Gwendolyn seems determined to defy her mother in the manner of the romantic heroines that she has read about and feels destined to emulate in marrying him. After she has left, Gwendolyn returns and says the following: "Although mother may prevent us from becoming man and wife, and I may marry someone else, and marry often, nothing that she possibly can do can alter my eternal devotion to you." Well, this is, of course, comic in that if your devotion is eternal, you're not going to marry anyone else, and certainly not several times. But then she observes, "The story of our romantic origin, as related to me by Mama with unpleasing comments, has naturally stirred the deepest fibers in my nature." Meaning, when she learns from her mother about Jack's dubious origins in Victoria Station, that very barrier, that very social barrier to their alliance, has only inflamed her desire. Barriers always do this, as we have seen in reading several tragedies in the course of high romance. Okay? So she is so inflamed by this barrier that she then asks, "What is your address in the country?" And Jack tells her that he will give it to her. Yes, Manor House, Wootton, Herefordshire. To which Gwendolyn replies, "It may be necessary to do something desperate." What does she have in mind? Well, we shall see. As a prospective married man, Jack would like to be truthful and sincere, and to put an end to his double life. This, however, is going to involve two steps. First, he must kill off his imaginary brother Earnest in an attempt at greater truth and sincerity. And he hopes that at least he can eliminate the imaginary reckless brother to the extent that he no longer has to lie about his existence to Cecily. But Jack wants to do something else, even more sincere, in order to try to consolidate a single identity. And the second step is that he plans to ask the local parson in the countryside, Chasuble, to christen him, that is, to baptize him with the name Earnest, thereby turning a kind of fictitious lie into the truth. This would make his long-standing lie to Gwendolyn, that his name is Earnest, honest, and it would remove the danger of her falling out of love with him if and when she finds out that his actual name is Jack. In short, rather than wanting to multiply personalities the way Wilde recommends and the way Algy does, Jack sincerely and earnestly wants to reduce all of these fictions to just one, insofar as he can. But, of course, there's something ironically self-defeating in this attempt, because in trying to eliminate the imaginary playboy brother and to settle down as a married man really named Earnest, what is Jack doing? He's turning away from all of the cosmopolitan gratifications of London that he has enjoyed under the name Earnest and that Gwendolyn likes about him. He's turning away from the theater and the men's club and the pleasure gardens, all the thing Algy mentions to him. No, I must give those up. They're associated with Earnest, and I want now, he suggests, to be someone who is more fully myself, whatever that self might be. Now, we know that Jack values those London entertainments because Cecily actually tells Miss Prism, her tutor, later that in the countryside her uncle often looks bored when he is with them. And it is at those times that he says, "Oh, I must go and see my terrible younger brother in the city," and makes up an excuse. So he would then, paradoxically, in an attempt sincerely to be one thing, be giving up not only things that he likes in London, but giving up that aspect of his earnest persona that Gwendolyn values. She, after all, associates the name Earnest with that man about town that Jack has been in London. She does not associate this name Ernest that she so covets with the quiet, devoted husband that he plans to be. So his efforts then at self-consolidation are inherently self-defeating. His plans for reform, of course, fail hilariously because Algy sees the country address that Jack has written down for Gwendolen so that she can join him there. And Algy decides that he will himself go as the embodiment, if you will, of Jack's imaginary younger brother Ernest, and that he will do so at the very time, it turns out, that Jack is heading to the country house to tell Cecily and Miss Prism and Chasuble and others that his wild younger sibling has perished. Thus, no need to lie about him any more as a pretext for going to London. Now, once before, Jack had threatened to send Ernest off to Australia, but now he feels that the only way to put an end to that fiction is to say that Ernest has died. Now, Act 2, and we turn there now, shifts the action from London to Jack's estate in the country, which he has inherited from the late Cardew, the man who found him in the handbag accidentally. He has inherited Cardew's estate and Cardew's money, or part of it at least, but also inherited the responsibility for raising Cardew's teenage niece, Cecily, who is Jack's ward. He's in charge of her until she reaches her majority, which is 18. Now, unlike Tartuffe, where the action on stage, we noted, obeyed the classical unities of time and place, the action in The Importance of Being Earnest is, as it also is in She Stoops to Conquer, one that occurs over the course of perhaps a day, but over the course of many hours, not just the length of the time it takes us to watch it. After all, the characters have to take the train from London and get to Jack's country house, which is where we move now. And we soon learn that, like Gwendolen, who fell in love with Jack before meeting him because she thought his name was Ernest, so too, by a remarkable coincidence in a play full of them, Cecily has fallen in love with the imaginary brother named Ernest, who Algy is impersonating, before ever seeing him. Simply hearing about this younger brother as a pretext from Jack has thrilled her with his dashing, wicked ways, and she's fallen in love with the idea of him. What attracts Cecily are all the traits that Jack has disparaged in this invented character. Ernest, as she imagines him through Jack's description, is passionate, reckless, pleasure-seeking, and rather dangerous. Jack claims that he must go up and rein him in and warns Cecily against him, but of course what he does inadvertently is to fill Cecily with fascination for this individual that she has never seen. That reputation of that Ernest in London enthralls her imagination, the imagination of a girl who is, of course, bored with her lessons in political science and German and geology, and who is isolated in the countryside among much older adults like Miss Prism and the Reverend Chasuble, who also warn her against the very traits in this imaginary Ernest that she finds so alluring. This sets up Cecily's meeting with Algy when he arrives, impersonating the black sheep brother Ernest. Why is Algy doing this? Well, it's partly a trick that he is using to punish his friend Jack for concealing his double identity from him. A double identity, you'll recall, that Algy discovered due to the inscription to, quote, Uncle Jack in the cigarette case that Cecily had given her uncle and that Jack accidentally left at Algy's apartment before the play opened. But Algy is motivated to this trick by something else, by his love of impersonation, by the opportunity to multiply identities, to create himself in other roles. Even though he knows very little about the character that he is playing, it's a form of entertainment. It's not just that it fights off boredom, though I think it does that, but it is a form of self-delight in the manufacture of new identities. But finally, there's a third reason why he comes down to Jack's country house impersonating Ernest. It is because Jack has let slip that his ward Cecily is very pretty, and Algy is drawn to the prospect of flirting with an innocent country girl as a kind of novelty for his own amusement, and also to irritate Jack, of course. But when he meets Cecily, something unexpected happens. She is not, as she appears, and talks to him quite the girl he might have imagined. Just before he walks in, Cecily says, "I have never really met any wicked person before. I feel rather frightened. I am so afraid he will look just like everyone else." She is fascinated by the idea of this figure, Ernest, as not looking like other men because he's more dashing, dark, exciting, because he's wicked. She'd be terribly disappointed if he turned out to be just a nice guy. Algernon enters, very gay and debonair, raising his hat. "You are my little cousin Cecily, I'm sure, and you are under some strange mistake. I am not little. In fact, I believe I am more than usually tall for my age." Algernon is rather taken aback. This is not what he expected. "But I am your cousin Cecily. You, I see from your card, are Uncle Jack's brother, my Uncle Ernest, my wicked Uncle Ernest," she says. "Oh," Algernon replies, "I'm not really wicked at all, Cousin Cecily. You mustn't think that I'm wicked." To which she replies, "If you are not, then you have certainly been deceiving us all in a very inexcusable manner. I hope you have not been leading a double life, pretending to be wicked and being really good all the time. That would be hypocrisy." Algernon, looking at her in amazement, "Oh, well, of course, I've been rather reckless." "Oh, I'm glad to hear it. In fact, now that you mention the subject, I've been very bad in my own small way." He immediately, and to his surprise, picks up on the idea that she is, this innocent girl, fascinated by the suggestion that he is somehow depraved, that he is transgressive, that he is wicked. And when he, using a kind of line almost as tired as the ones that we see Marlowe using in trying to seduce the barmaid in She Stoops to Conquer, when he says to Cecily, "You are like a pink rose, Cousin Cecily." Cecily says, "I don't think it can be right for you to talk to me like that. Miss Prism never says such things to me." The idea, this is a tired old line. This is rather silly. Then Miss Prism is a short-sighted old lady. "Oh, Miss Prism says that all good looks are a snare," to which Algy replies, "They're a snare that every sensible man would like to be caught on." To which Cecily replies, "Oh, I don't think I would care to catch a sensible man. I shouldn't know what to talk to him about." No, I don't want a sensible man. I don't want a man who uses ordinary, seductive cliches. I want a man who is wicked. I want a man who is dangerous. Now, Cecily's delight in the idea of this wickedness in Ernest amazes Algy. And what also amazes him is her irony, her tendency to invert conventional expectation, and her paradoxical way of speaking. "I wouldn't care for a sensible man, and it would be hypocrisy if you were just pretending to be bad and be good all along." She turns ideas on their head. It's the kind of ironic play, the kind of paradox-ridden language and attitude that Algy himself delights in and practices. So he falls in love with her unexpectedly, not just because she is pretty, but rather because she is so much like him, so much on his wavelength. Now, when Jack enters, dressed in mourning and announcing that his brother Ernest is dead, Algy immediately turns up to tell him, "Oh, well, no, actually, I'm here. He's alive. I'm alive." And he vows to reform. But he doesn't do this, of course, sincerely. Unlike Jack, Algy doesn't mean it. He doesn't really want to be a serious, stable individual. It's just his pretext for being there as Ernest, which is to say, "I've come down to the countryside to tell you, brother, that I'm going to be better." Not for a minute would he do it, and he realizes it would be the last thing that Cecily would want. By this point, he realizes that for all of her girlish innocence, Cecily is an ironic creature of sparkling wit like himself, and he has no intention of reforming either for himself or because it would disappoint her. The only problem is that she, Cecily, like Gwendolen, can love him, she says, only if she believes, as she does, that his name is Ernest. Now, instead of killing off a lie by putting an end to brother Ernest, Jack is then caught in a lie, claiming that Ernest died when Ernest is in fact still breathing. So that Jack's only recourse on being caught in this lie is to say that he is sending Ernest, that is Algy, back to London. Now, Jack is not at all amused by Algy's antics here, which he fears, among other things, may corrupt his ward Cecily. And Jack is becoming more and more humorless and more desperately sincere at a time when everyone else in the play speaks in paradoxes and inversions at one time or another. This is even true of Miss Prism, who in the course of things says the following to Chasuble, with whom she is secretly in love. By persistently remaining single, a man converts himself into a permanent public temptation. Men should be more careful. This very celibacy lends weaker vessels astray. When a man like you is single and virtuous, your very celibacy increases our desire, so you better be careful. You're leading us astray by your virtue. Okay. Now, Algy's declaration of love and his proposal to Cecily that occur in their second meeting is one of the wittiest and most delightful scenes in the play. And I hope you enjoyed watching the clip that I asked you to view with Dorothy Tootin as Cecily and Michael Dennison as Algy. In this scene, Cecily, like Gwendolen, effectively does the proposing herself. She agrees to everything that Algy was going to suggest by way of their marital alliance in advance, and explains to him, again to his astonishment, that she has in fact been conducting their relationship in her imagination and in her diary for months before he ever unexpectedly turned up, somehow like Gwendolen, with a sense of destiny. Cecily said that Uncle Jack would be very annoyed if he knew you were staying on till next week at the same hour. Algernon says, "Oh, I don't care about Jack. I don't care about anybody in the world, just you, Cecily." To which Cecily says that, well, you know, we've been engaged for the last 3 months. Oh, for the last 3 months, he asked. Yes, it will be exactly 3 months on Thursday. But how did we become engaged? Well, ever since Uncle Jack first confessed to us that he had a younger brother who was very wicked and bad, you, of course, have formed the chief topic of our conversation between myself and Miss Prism. And, of course, a man who is much talked about is always very attractive. One feels there must be something in him, after all. I dare say it was foolish of me, but I fell in love with you, Ernest. Darling, and when was the engagement actually settled? Oh, on the 14th of February, Valentine's Day last. Worn out by your entire ignorance of my existence, I determined to end the matter one way or the other, and after a long struggle with myself, I accepted you under this dear tree here. The next day, I bought this little ring in your name, and this is the little bangle with the true lover's knot I promised you always to wear. Did I give you this? It's very pretty, isn't it? Yes, you've wonderfully good taste, Ernest. It's the excuse I've always given for your leading such a bad life. Cecily goes on that in the course of this imaginary engagement and romance, you wrote me letters, which of course she has written to herself in his name. The 3 you wrote me after I'd broken off the engagement are so beautiful and so badly spelled that even now I can hardly read them without crying a little. But broke off the engagement? Why? It would hardly have been a really serious engagement, Cecily says, if it hadn't been broken off at least once. But I forgave you before the week was out. Algernon, crossing to her and kneeling, as Jack had knelt to Gwendolen. What a perfect angel you are. Cecily responds, you dear romantic boy. He kisses her and puts her fingers through his hair. Now, you'll note that in the course of this, what Wilde is suggesting something about the nature of romantic love that is serious, but which comes through in this ironic and rather hilarious style. First, he's suggesting that our ideas of love derive from the books that we read. Certainly this has been the case with Cecily. Her diary, all about their imagined relationship and engagement and broken engagement and reformed engagement, that entire diary in her imagination that has fueled it is derived from the plots of popular romance novels. Remember that Wilde proposed that art does not imitate life so much as life imitates art. Well, here's an instance. This is what Cecily has done. She has imitated in her life what she has read about in popular art. She conducts her love affair with Algy in imitation of what she has read. Now, throughout the scene, then, Cecily is a curious mixture of impressionable innocence who imitates things that she has read because she actually believes in them, and yet at the same time she is a creature of mature irony because she also seems to laugh rather lightheartedly at these very literary conventions that she has been adapting in her life. But Wilde is, I think, suggesting something else about love here in this scene, beyond the idea that it is based very often an imitation of what we've read. It's also the idea, again, presented here in a kind of indirect way through a playful style. It's the idea that love is essentially a subjective illusion. We fall in love romantically, not so much with people as with ideas that we superimpose upon them, sometimes before we have even actually met them, and then when we do meet them, we superimpose that idea again. Finally, I think in this comic encounter, Wilde may be critiquing love in still another way, or the practice of romantic love. And that is, we have to realize, I think, that there's a narcissistic element in Algernon's fascination with Cecily here. He loves her because he has surprisingly discovered that she is like him, a creature of irony and wit and paradox and verbal dexterity. In short, Algy is enchanted with aspects of himself that he sees reflected in her. Her playful love of paradox, her fascination with artifice of the kind he likes. For example, when she puts her fingers through his hair, she says, "I hope your hair curls naturally, does it?" To which Algernon says, "Yes, darling, with a little help from others," to which she said, "I'm so glad," meaning, all right, well, I hope it's natural curls. No, it's not. Even better. It's artificial. Yes, she loves the idea of artifice and loves to play with it, so that it's almost as if she is winking at the idea that what she's doing here is natural, because at some level she understands that it's all an imitation of what she's read. Now, the problem that Algernon faces is that, like Gwendolen, she thinks that she can only love a man whose name is Ernest, and like Gwendolen, it is her long-standing dream to marry a man named Ernest. She requires it and says, "Darling, it has always been a girlish dream of mine to love someone whose name was Ernest." Well, that's one problem that Algy faces. But another problem is that, after all, both Gwendolen and Cecily love what they think is the same Ernest. And this conflict arises when Gwendolen arrives in the country, possibly planning an elopement. This may have been what she said earlier when she said we may have to do something desperate. And an elopement is certainly what Lady Bracknell thinks is going on, and that she is preventing when, hearing about her daughter's flight from a servant, she takes the train and turns up a little bit later. When Lady Bracknell arrives, you'll note that she says, "I was appraised of my daughter's sudden flight by her trusty maid, whose confidence I purchased by means of a small coin, and I followed her at once in a luggage train." The idea that she is referring to this as her daughter's flight and that she feels she has to intercept it implies that she expects that what Gwendolen has in mind here is to run off without her permission and marry Jack. The meeting over tea between Cecily and Gwendolen before Lady Bracknell's arrival is full of delicious reversals and satiric thrusts on Wilde's part at the silly code of certain polite social customs. First, there's the exaggerated fondness the two of them display on first meeting, although they scarcely know of one another's existence. Then there's the sudden reversal from this exaggerated fondness to mutual suspicion and jealousy when they discover that they are both in love with and engaged to the same Ernest. So they think, when in truth there really is no Ernest at all, even though they think you're the same man. Gwendolen asserts in this conversation her prior claim to Ernest, who had proposed to her before he allegedly proposed to Cecily. And Cecily counters by insisting that her claim to the engagement with Ernest is stronger because he obviously had changed his mind when he met her. This leads to hilarious insults and sniping over tea, that most tradition-bound of all English customs. Tea now becomes not a polite social custom, but under the surface a kind of battleground between these two antagonistic women. Cecily, obeying the superficial decencies of going through with the tea ceremony, "May I offer you some tea, Miss Fairfax?" Gwendolen, with elaborate politeness, "Thank you." Aside, a detestable girl, but I require tea. The English can't go, a day without tea. "Sugar?" Cecily asks. Gwendolen, superciliously, "No, thank you. Sugar is not fashionable anymore." Cecily looks angrily at her and takes up the tongs and puts in 4 lumps of sugar into the cup, just to spite Gwendolen. Cecily then says severely, "Cake or bread and butter?" Gwendolen, in a bored manner, "Bread and butter, please. Cake is rather rarely seen in the best homes nowadays." To which Cecily then cuts a very large slice of cake, again to defy Gwendolen, and puts it on the tray. "Hand that to Miss Fairfax." Gwendolen, "You have filled my tea with lumps of sugar, and though I most distinctly asked for bread and butter, you have given me cake. I am known for my gentleness of my disposition and the extraordinary sweetness of my nature, but I warn you, Miss Cardew, you may go too far." Well, note the role of food in this play. Algy and Jack will later struggle over muffins in a similar way. Wilde presents food and the withholding food as a means to aggression under the surface of genteel custom. Remember that tea is a communal ritual in Britain, a time-honored one that is supposed to unite people, to bring them together in this ritual way. But instead, it functions here in a comically inverted fashion, and the tea ceremony becomes a site of division and conflict between these two young women. Well, when Jack and Algy enter, some of this confusion that Gwendolen and Cecily are confronting is temporarily resolved. They now realize that they are actually engaged to 2 different men, and that is certainly a relief. But a new problem arises that causes the women abruptly to abandon Jack and Algy and retreat into the house. They do this on 2 grounds. First, the women object to the fact that both Jack and Algy have deceived them about their actual names, okay? So they're objecting to the deception. But they are also objecting to something else that drives them indoors, and that is the fact that neither of them is actually named Ernest, and therefore they are not lovable in the sense that they had dreamed their mate would be named Ernest. And they feel then not merely deceived, but betrayed by what they fear, or claim, at least, they cannot love. Gwendolen says, "The gentleman who is now embracing you is my cousin, Mr. Algernon Moncrief." Cecily, "Algernon Moncrief?" Oh, the 2 girls move toward one another and put their arms around each other's waists as if for protection. "Are you called Algernon?" Algernon says, "I cannot deny it." "Oh! Is your name really John?" Gwendolen then asks of Jack. Jack standing proudly. "I could deny it if I like. I could deny anything if I like, but my name is certainly John. It has been John for years." Cecily to Gwendolen, "A gross deception has been practiced on both of us. Let us flee." Now, in leaving, Gwendolen and Cecily feel, or at least pretend to feel, that they're no longer engaged, because after all, they fell in love with and became affianced not so much to an individual man as to a name, to the name Ernest. Jack says, I will tell you quite frankly also that I have no brother Ernest. I have no brother at all. Cecily says, no brother at all? Jack, none. Had you never a brother of any kind? Jack pleasantly, no, never of any kind. Gwendolen then says, I am afraid it is quite clear, Cecily, that neither of us is engaged to be married to anyone any more. Now, all of this seems like pure silliness. But again, under the surface of this comic play, Wilde is suggesting something significant about human nature and human conduct. That is, we fall in love not with real people, but with our ideas of them, even if it is something as silly as falling in love with a name. It's a serious idea, the notion that we fall in love with people that we don't know, but which somehow correspond to our ideas of them rather than to their actuality. But it's an idea that he pushes to comic absurdity. Love may be an illusion, it may be an invention, but on the other hand, it is perhaps worse, Wilde suggests, than falling in love with an illusion. It's worse to try to be serious and sincere, as Jack is doing now. That seems even more absurd and much more tedious, this emphasis upon sincerity and getting to the truth of things. Nobody seems to enjoy that, Algy least of all. And he chastises his friend. What on earth are you serious about? I haven't got the remotest idea, Jack. About everything, I should fancy. You have such an absolutely trivial nature. You're trivial because you're so damn serious. And as we've seen for a while, you can only really be serious if you're being playful. Now, Gwendolen, who delights herself in epigrammatic paradoxes, every bit as much as Algy and Cecily, Gwendolen puts this key idea, I think, even more clearly in Act 3 when she says the following. In matters of grave importance, style, not sincerity, is the vital thing. Irony, artifice, paradox, that's style, indirection. It's the style that Gwendolen and Cecily want in their men, and that we've seen. It is also the style through which Wilde himself in this play explores serious subjects about the nature of love and identity. Put simply, what Gwendolen expresses is essentially an inversion of the play's title. What she really suggests is the importance of not being earnest, of not being ploddingly straightforward and sincere. Thus, the play's title is itself a playful paradox, because there seems to be no real importance at all in being earnest, but rather it is important, after all, not to be earnest. She can't love a man who is earnest, and Wilde can't abide individuals who are earnest. Nor is anyone, after all, in the play really named Ernest, so it seems at this moment. Now, although Gwendolen and Cecily have retreated indoors in indignation at the deception, at the lies, and at the absence of the name Ernest as an actual name, although they've retreated indoors, they fully expect Jack and Algernon to follow them and to explain the reason for their deceptions. And indeed, the two women promptly forgive the deceptions when they hear for what passes as truth. But the second problem still remains, at least ostensibly. Neither man is named Ernest. But Jack and Algernon overcome this barrier when they tell the women that they have both planned to be christened with the name Ernest that afternoon, thereby becoming what they claimed they were. And their willingness to do this alone, this gesture, strikes Gwendolen and Cecily as so profoundly heroic and self-sacrificial that the women now love them, it seems, despite their wrong names, just because they were willing to go through this. Gwendolen says, speaking Gwendolen and Cecily together, your Christian names are still an insuperable barrier, that is all. Jack and Algernon, speaking together then, our Christian names, is that all? We are going both to be christened this afternoon. Gwendolen then says to Jack, For my sake you are prepared to do this terrible thing? I am. Cecily to Algernon, to please me, you are ready to face this fearful ordeal? I am. Gwendolen then says, how absurd to talk of the equality of the sexes, where questions of self-sacrifice are concerned. Men are infinitely beyond us. Jack says, yes, we are. They clasp hands, he and Algernon, and Cecily observes, they have moments of physical courage of which we women know absolutely nothing. Oh, darling, embrace me! And they fall, Jack and Gwendolen, Algernon and Cecily, into each other's arms. This mock heroic tone in the scene is a source of rich comedy. We laugh as the women compare a name change near a baptismal fount to some terrible epic encounter that only the bravest of men can face, an ordeal. Well, being ironic creatures themselves, perhaps the women say these things in a tongue-in-cheek fashion, and that it's quite possible that despite their disappointment at finding that neither man is named Ernest, that they really intended not to call off the engagements all along. It's a little ambiguous, but they're so playful that it seems altogether possible. But at this point, as the two couples embrace, enters the indomitable Lady Bracknell. She arrives and once again forbids her daughter Gwendolen's marriage to Jack. Lady Bracknell also disapproves, when she hears of it, of her nephew Algernon's engagement to Cecily, because she assumes Cecily is no more connected with a good family, being Jack's ward, than Jack is. She disapproves, therefore, of the alliance until Jack mentions that his ward has a large inheritance, and this produces a comic reversal in Lady Bracknell. We see here that Lady Bracknell shares Wilde's own preference for artifice over nature in one's appearance and personal style, because while she embraces tradition, she does so with a kind of knowing irony and even cynicism about marriage, and she is also the master of paradoxical epigram. We are told that when she finds out about this, she says, "Praise, sir, of my daughter's sudden," when she finds out about it, she says, "I had better ask you if Miss Cardew has any little fortune," to which Jack replies, "Oh, about £130,000 in funds." "Ah, a moment. Miss Cardew seems to me now a most attractive young lady, now that I look at her. Few girls of the present day have any really solid qualities, the qualities that last and improve with time. We live, I regret to say, in an age of surfaces." Turning to Cecily, "Come over here, dear." Cecily goes across. "Pretty child, your dress is sadly simple, and your hair seems almost as nature might have left it. But we can soon alter that. A thoroughly experienced French maid produces a really marvelous result in a very brief span of time. I remember recommending one of the young Lady Lansings, and after 3 months her husband did not even know her." Now, in this delicious moment, you'll note that Lady Bracknell delights in the idea that this girl, Cecily, who is wearing a rather plain dress and whose hair seems as nature might have left it, can be altered. She can be made to look artificial, because Lady Bracknell, like Wilde, embraces the artificial in every possible way. Seeing that that Cecily is rich, she immediately imagines, well, what can I make of her? Something other than what is natural. I can send her a French hairstylist so that even her husband won't recognize her soon, my nephew Algy. Multiply artifice. Now, seeing Lady Bracknell's sudden change of heart, her desire to connect her family with Cecily's fortune, Jack sees an opportunity, and he seizes it. He withholds consent to Cecily's marriage to Algy because she is not yet of age, unless Lady Bracknell will permit him to marry Gwendolen. He and Lady Bracknell now both command the fate of these young women. But at this point, when the marriages appear to be very much in jeopardy, because one doubts that Lady Bracknell would submit to that kind of coercion, when it appears that both marriages, in fact, may not take place, Wilde gives us a kind of deus ex machina, and I think a tongue-in-cheek reference to the Greek tradition that makes the happy ending we expect possible. It is not the sudden invention of the king, as we saw in Tartuffe, but rather a coincidence involving the improbable deus ex machina figure of Miss Prism, whose name Lady Bracknell almost accidentally hears and summons when she hears that name, Prism. It strikes her so forcibly that she says, catching sight of Lady Bracknell, Prism says, who has fixed her with a stony gaze. Miss Bracknell is gazing at Miss Prism with a stony gaze. Prism grows pale and quails. She looks anxiously round as if desirous to escape. Lady Bracknell then in a severe judicial tone says, Prism? Miss Prism bows her head in shame. Come here, Prism. Miss Prism approaches in a humble manner. Prism, where is that baby? Miss Prism explains. Lady Bracknell, I admit with shame that I do not know where that baby is. I only wish I did. The plain facts of the case are these. On the morning of the day you mention, a day that is forever branded on my memory, I prepared as usual to take the baby out of its perambulator. I had also with me a somewhat old but capacious handbag in which I had intended to place the manuscript of a work of fiction that I had written during my few unoccupied hours. In a moment of mental abstraction for which I can never forgive myself, I deposited the manuscript in the bassinet and placed the baby in the handbag. In mixing up the baby, Jack, with the manuscript she has written, Prism inverts the relationship between life, the infant, and art, the manuscript, much as Wilde suggests that there is a constant inversion of life and art in which life imitates art. Here we find the child goes where the art should have been and the art goes where the child should have been. Well, hearing this disclosure of her mistake, Jack thinks that at last he has found the key to his parentage. Because when he hears Prism say this, he assumes that she, Prism, who was pushing him in the perambulator, must be his mother. That is, until Lady Bracknell announces that the child in the pram was actually her nephew, the son of her sister. This, too, comes as a sudden and unexpected revelation. When Jack learns this, Miss Prism says, there, pointing to Lady Bracknell, is the lady who can tell you who you really are. Jack, Lady Bracknell, I hate to seem inquisitive, but would you kindly inform me of who I am? Lady Bracknell says, I'm afraid that the news I have to give you will not altogether please you. You are the son of my poor sister, Mrs. Moncrief, and consequently you're Algernon's elder brother. Gwendolen then says to Jack, my own, but what own are you? What is your Christian name now that you have become someone else, now that you have become essentially my cousin? To which Jack says, a Christian name. Yes, then I was Christian. That is settled. Now what name was I given? Let me know the worst. Hearing from Lady Bracknell that he is the son of her sister, Jack looks earnestly and longingly to find the birth name that will, he hopes, confer upon him some genuine identity, some fixed sense of self. The very last thing Oscar Wilde believes in, but what Jack desperately wants. But does he find that true identity associated with his birth name? Well, consider Jack's response when he discovers that, like his father, who had been in the army, his christening name was the same as his father's, and that name given to him as a newborn was Earnest. I always told you, Gwendolen, my name was Earnest, didn't I? Well, it is Earnest after all. I mean, it naturally is Earnest. Lady Bracknell says, yes, I remember that the general was called Earnest. I know I had some particular reason for disliking that name. Gwendolen, Ernest, my dear Ernest, I felt from the first that you could have no other name. To which then Jack replies, Gwendolyn, it is a terrible thing for a man to find out suddenly that all his life he's been speaking nothing but the truth. Can you forgive me? Well, almost inadvertently, Jack has one of the richest paradoxes. How terrible to discover one has actually been speaking the truth one's entire life. Well, despite this celebration on the part of both Jack and Gwendolyn, despite Jack's relief that he really is named Earnest, and Gwendolyn's delight that the man she's going to marry is named Earnest, despite that, the name doesn't really fit Jack necessarily, and there doesn't seem to be anything natural about it. It is the name of a military man who was his father, and there doesn't seem to be anything particularly militaristic about Jack. He feels no intrinsic connection to parents that he never met, and it seems that although he claims in some way that, yes, you see, I was right all along, I really am Earnest, that what Wilde is revealing here is that the name itself is merely arbitrary. It is no more genuine than the fictional role he was playing. The fact is that we can be whomever we want for Wilde because there is no intrinsic core to self to make any name given to us ring false or ring true, despite Jack's clutching onto the idea that he really is Earnest. Think of it. Heretofore, Jack has been John or Jack in the country for his ward. He has also been fake Earnest, so named, in the city for Gwendolyn and Algy and others. And he has also been the older brother of an invented figure whom he called Earnest. Okay? He's been all these different things. He is now legally and soon to be married Earnest. But the fact is that none of these names or roles that accompany those names define Jack in any genuine way. He is, in a sense, all of them, no matter what he may tell himself. Identity is not something that has any inherent cohesion. Identity is simply a series of roles and the names we assign to those roles. Well, what then is the importance of being Earnest as a name, okay? And also the importance of Earnest as an adjective meaning sincere. Jack ends the play by saying, I've now realized for the first time in my life the vital importance of being earnest. What is the importance? Well, the first is of no real importance at all. The name, no real importance at all, even though he thinks it is. And the latter meaning of earnest, as in straightforwardness and sincerity, well, that is the antithesis of what Gwendolyn wants in a husband. And one wonders how the marriage will go, since Jack seems increasingly determined not only to be named Earnest, but also to be Earnest. Whereas his London persona as Earnest was, in fact, not quite so earnest at all. Although he is Gwendolyn's first cousin, it's interesting to know, the two are still going to marry. The fact of this sort of quasi-incestuous union among members of the same bloodline, cousins, first cousins, doesn't seem to bother anyone. And in a way, I think Wilde leaves out any mention of it because it indicates how inbred this upper-class world of British society really is. If, after all, a fortune is involved and there are no impediments, and indeed Gwendolyn and Jack have the same aristocratic pedigree, then of course they can go ahead, even though in fact they're first cousins. Jack will, however, as a married man, have to adjust to the idea that his friend Algernon is actually now both his brother and also the husband of his ward Cecily. All these relationships, of course, are nominally being reconfigured through a series of coincidences late in this play that are so contrived and so improbable that we are deliberately reminded of Wilde's dictum that art should be artificial, that art should, in Wilde's word, lie. It should be fanciful. It should be as unrealistic as possible. And certainly the end of the play fits that description. Wilde ends the comedy with a parody of the double marriages that we get very often at the end of Shakespearean romantic comedies and also at the end of plays like She Stoops to Conquer, where two couples wed. We saw it also in the Merchant of Venice. And that double marriage reinforces the notion that order has been restored. Well, here we get the idea, we get this sort of convention, not through three, but what appear to be, not through two, but what appear to be three weddings that will occur. Jack, now named Ernest and Gwendolen, Algernon and Cecily, but also Miss Prism and Chasuble, okay, who have gotten beyond their shyness and reserve and seem now about to be wed. Like everything else, then, about courtship and marriage in this play, we find Wilde at the end gently mocking both the customs of courtship and the institution of marriage by taking everything to such exaggerated extremes that it becomes parodic, that it becomes funny. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this play. We will turn next time to a fascinating and much darker comedy, Synge's Playboy of the Western World. And I'll be talking about the first half of that when we meet again on Friday. Okay? Goodbye.